Hello, everyone. Welcome back to episode 4. So, if this is the first time that you're viewing, this is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. I'm 4AS, and welcome to my co host, Mr. E. How are you going today?
I am well, thank you. 4IS, how are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well. I'm glad it's rolled back to the next podcast episode because I feel like we've got an interesting one today.
We do. You
So,
you have been reading something very interesting recently, haven't you?
yes, one of the very few female theorists, socialist theorists, that I could find, Rosa Luxemburg. And yeah, I've been reading her book, Reform or Revolution.
Mm.
It's
Integral female socialist figure. She is one of the juggernauts of the movement 100 years ago.
Well, she was such a juggernaut that it even says in the foreword of the book that this book was really important for the 1905 and the 1917 revolution for Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. So, yeah, this was a very formidable piece of work, really.
Seminal text. And this is Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution.
Yes.
Mm. Mm. Big question. Massive question. We spent a bit of time talking about revolution, but what about reform?
Well, this is kind of the reason why Rosa Luxemburg writes this book, is because around the time that she writes this book, which was close to the start of the 1900s, she actually had a contemporary, Edward Bernstein, that at the time, right before that, with Marx and Engels, there was a lot of talk about how capitalism was, quite destructive, that it basically was eating itself and those kind of sentiments.
Yeah.
And it was at this time that, capitalism had been successful enough that the idea of revisionism was coming about. So, what this was, or at least in the socialist context, what this was, is a lot of socialists were looking at the ideas that Marx and Engels had presented 100 years before that. And they were saying, wait, like this great destruction of capitalism, that didn't quite happen. Should we rethink our position? So Edward Bernstein and his contemporaries were thinking, well, yeah, maybe we should. Maybe we should be working with capitalism. And basically, Rosa goes into the ideas of trade unions and cooperatives. And I guess a long story short, I'll use the paraphrase phrase of these kind of institutions. They kind of treat the symptoms of capitalism, or at least the destructive symptoms of capitalism, and they don't actually prevent it. They kind of
so let's just dial it back here for the people that aren't as familiar with what we're talking about here. You're talking about up until I guess after Marx, after Marx and Engels do their thing and really, I guess, set the tone for the international workers' movement.
Yes.
Based on their principles, which is socialism, and so that the movement away from capitalist mode into the socialist mode through the idea of revolution.
Yes.
With primarily the intention being violent struggle. And the dictatorship or the rule of the proletariat, the working class, over the ruling class at the time, the bourgeois. Okay, and they're like an actual revolution in terms of its takeover. Whereas by 50 years after their writing, more than that, you start to get people rethinking Marxism or reappropriating it or reapplying it and saying, okay, we can still have all these Marxist kind of ideals here and these socialist visions. However, maybe we don't need the violent struggle. Maybe we don't need the revolution here. We can do this from within a capitalist framework. We can achieve the same things for working people within the capitalist framework. That's what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, because effectively what Karl Marx and Engels was saying was, that we needed to seize the means of production,
right,
and promote class consciousness, which effectively was, as you were kind of saying, that, well, we don't really need the capitalists anymore. We're kind of the new stage of evolution in society, this new ideology. So we can take what is there in society and move forward with it. But as you say, the revisionists were saying, well, the idea of the proletariat taking over, that didn't quite happen, and the means of production are still in capitalist hands, and this new revolution hasn't occurred. So maybe instead of taking it off them in a violent struggle, or what they perceive to be a violent struggle, let's just kind of work with them and form a new society that way.
So from within the realms of capitalist society, bourgeois culture, work within the means of that framework, change things over time, legislation, rewrite constitutions if you have to, but do it within a peaceful and kind of evolutionary or transformative way, as opposed to some type of actual antagonism, some actual struggle between two classes and then one prevailing over the other. You kind of change it from within and then hope that reform and that regulation is what delivers you this new socialist society.
Yeah, one, which was the reformists, wanted to work within the system that was already established in order to improve it. Whereas the revolutionary wanted to say, no, let's discard the old system, and our ideals, we believe in them. Let's implement a new system.
Yeah.
One is discarding the system, one is just reforming the system from within.
Right. And so this revisionism. Now, these people obviously were trying to just make capitalism better then in the interim, or they didn't want to get rid of capitalism at all? Were they kind of seeking to maintain this power structure, this bourgeois culture?
No, I think this probably brings us to our next point, in the sense of this is where the idea of evolutionary socialism comes from. So I think what was in the mind of your Edward Bernstein's and his contemporaries were, if we're because really in Poland and Germany, like basically all of these places that Rosa Luxemburg had at least a lot of scope, or at least a lot of understanding in her world, is a lot of cooperatives, a lot of trade unions were kind of popping up at the time. So it was a viable option within that society that, the trade unions, while, forming picket lines, or at least putting pressure internally on your capitalists to improve wages, because effectively that was a simple way to increase your profits, is just to immediately attack a worker's wage. So both, you have a two-pronged attack where the trade unions are working within a capitalist company in order to increase the workers' wages. And then you had outside of that system, or at least critiquing that system, where you had the cooperatives that were for the workers, and they were basically competition for the capitalists, where they had set up their networks where they were working all together. And at least the assumption is that working together, they would be able to improve workers' jobs, and also provide an alternate company system where the capitalists would eventually have to improve their workers' situations. So it eventually became more egalitarian. So there was a two-pronged approach of, hey, let's work within the companies, and hey, let's work outside those said companies to both times improve workers'
conditions.
Yeah, the workers'
conditions, their pay. But so what I'm hearing though is these acts in themselves are not revolutionary though.
No.
They're evolutionary. So they're working within the capitalist system to improve parts of the capitalist system for the working class. But they're not changing capitalism as such. They're humanizing it.
Yes.
They're making it more palatable for the mass of people. So they're not working under horrendous kind of, original industrial revolution style working environments. They're getting some benefits now. They might have some type of regulation around their working days. They might have some regulation around their pay. They might have a bit of leave coming in, some recognition that they're more than just tools in the process. But again, this is evolutionary in the sense that they are seeking to change capitalism in the long run.
Yes.
By changing it slowly from within the inside and reforming it. But that is something I'm assuming that Rosa Luxemburg is critiquing heavily, though, isn't she, in her work?
Oh, yeah. Because in it, she feels like this evolutionary socialist way of thinking is, one, either impossible, or two, it's just completely naive on the side of the socialist that agrees to this line of thinking.
Okay, so let's go with number one there. Why is it impossible? That's important to establish.
Well, okay, this is where the example that I wanted to use with the trade unions immediately comes into play. So a great way to show why it's impossible is that logic that I was giving you before, where, trade unions can, rally the workers, have solidarity, and then, form a picket line and say, hey, we're not going to work until you improve our situation. So when she views it on the ideas that Karl Marx and Engels had established, so, seizing the means of production, creating class consciousness, blah, blah, blah. When you look at it through that kind of framing, trade unions, they don't seize the means of production. They kind of don't increase class consciousness because, one, you obviously have the members, but everyone that's kind of going to go to the strike are those members. They might convince a majority of the workers in order to from that factory to come to the strike, but you're going to have people that are within that union as well as not.
Yes.
But I think the thing that is really damning for revisionists in this line of thinking that Rosa talks about is, well, when you are just jockeying back and forth with your capitalist overlord about wages, not really seizing the means of production. You're basically saying to your capitalist overlord, oh, can you pretty please give me a few more coins? It really would be good for my family.
Yeah.
I'm probably being a bit facetious there, but like just to kind of give an idea of it's not taking the reason why they got that capital in the first place. You're just basically kind of coming to the table and agreeing that you're raising their wages, so they shave off a bit of their profit.
Right.
Then
so
they
in a crude way, you're vying for larger scraps from the table.
Yes.
But so in the sense of impossibility then, so it makes it impossible for a trade union movement or a particular union to do anything about ensuring that capitalism is fixed forever from a working class perspective or revolutionized, because when you have one trade union fighting for their rights and their conditions, they might humanize capitalism in relation to their trade union, but they do so in isolation. And yes, they might get better benefits for their workers and their members, but they're not doing it for workers everywhere. They're not doing it for the working class, the international workers movement, or the whole working class within their country. They're doing it specifically for their own members. They're doing it specifically for their own people. And so you don't have a change in the capitalist system. You just have a hiccup in one industry in which the capitalists will all get together, I'm assuming, at some point or another, and then figure out a way to make sure this doesn't happen again, or figure out a way in which to make sure this doesn't happen in their industries also. So they might just all decide, okay, these people have fight for these rights. They want a 12-hour working day, not a 16-hour working day. Let's make everyone a 12-hour working day. And then maybe they'll all calm down and go away. But we can keep going on with our little capitalist kind of system, and no one is going to question us again. So it's impossible to change or revolutionize or to get to socialism through these type of actions, through individual trade union, like organizing and such.
Yeah, and I'd like to put the disclaimer that I don't see anything wrong with trade unions or anything wrong with cooperatives, but
no, we're talking about getting to socialism here. We're talking about achieving socialism, achieving revolution, or reforming capitalism. And I think it's important in that context then to try and grasp what Rosa Luxemburg's talking about here.
Yeah.
That's why I asked, why is it impossible then to get socialism or revolution through trade union movements, through cooperatives? Why is it impossible to do it through cooperatives?
Well, this is the part that I have to go back over.
Yeah.
But I definitely remember when I was reading through it the first time, there was a lot of focus around capital. Yeah. And this again was speaking to the means of production, because let's just roll back just a bit and talk about, such concepts such as the Rochdale principles, or what you would consider are cooperatives' big principles. So the idea of intercooperation, so working with other cooperatives in a in a network, and those sort of concepts. She doesn't mention those specifically, but she definitely talks about, well, in terms of seizing the means of production, again, capital, because you are starting something with all of the workers, really it's kind of the capitalists that own all of the capital. So you're effectively starting a business where you're tying one hand behind your back, because you're not necessarily taking away the capitalist control of that line of production, or should I say supply chain, if to use a modern term. While you are giving a competitor, you're not actually stopping the flow of profits that the capitalists had already begun with to begin with, like had already begun with when you made that cooperative.
Right. So like in a sense, like cooperatives, while they might be nice in and of themselves, almost like this stuff we're talking about, the trade union movements in and of themselves, they might be doing nice little things here, but they're not changing the overall system. And they're not changing the dominant culture, which is bourgeois culture. And like I think we've talked about this sort of stuff already when we've talked about Trotsky and like his idea of permanent revolution. And like his idea of permanent revolution came down, and I think this is one of the most pertinent kind of ideas in his whole thesis or his argument, is really the idea that like you don't stop having socialism in one country because bourgeois culture, the capitalist mode of production is the dominant form of production, and bourgeois culture is the dominant form of culture across the world. And so like if you have socialism in one country, eventually the bourgeois powers, whether they're allied or not, or they work in coalition, it doesn't matter, will eventually figure out a way to get into your system and destroy it from the inside, or they'll just destroy it from the outside. Whatever, it erodes the socialism in that one place until it is completely taken over and turned capitalist again. Like you could say for what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, and look at Russia now. It is a capitalist country run by a team of oligarchs. So like in the same sense, then you have this idea of if you don't have unity and a kind of conceited effort and a collective approach to bringing about socialism with particular techniques, be it trade union organization or union movements and cooperatives, all working and trying to take and seize the means of production in themselves with a conceited effort and actual vision about how to do things, them all working isolated doesn't do anything. It does do little things here and there, but like in terms of bringing about socialism, that revolutionary change, which is supposed to be what revisionism is about, right? And reform is about. It's supposed to be getting to socialism somehow. But if you do that in a piecemeal approach, if you do that in isolated or in like little silos, you're never going to get there. And I think that's the impossibility that you're talking about before. It's impossible to do it because you can't do it alone. That's why they had the International Workers Association.
Yeah.
It was a group of people with representatives of the working class from all over the world who got together to be like, all right, how are we going to do this collectively? Because even they knew you could have the strongest like trade unions in one country, the strongest union movements with the best working conditions. If there were other people in other countries with poor working conditions, capitalism will find a way to just, you can win all you want over here and you can get all the best working conditions. But if you are too expensive, then because you've got all this good stuff over here, capitalists will just go somewhere else to find cheap labor and they will outsource things, and then you will have no working class over there effectively. Capitalism will find a way unless you work collectively and internationally. Collectively, we're talking about here, not just within your own trade or just within your own nation.
But what Rosa talks about, though, is certain ideas that I kind of feel like socialism glosses over, or at least what was previously what would have been talked about as a revisionist socialist point or a revolutionary socialist point. At least in modern day, it kind of gets glossed over. Like, you know, people talk about Marx's ideas, Engels' ideas, and we do know that in our societies we have trade unions and cooperatives. But this sort of divide that Rosa talks about, it's stuff that until I read this book, I never really questioned. And she does raise some good points that you almost have to have a line in the sand if you really want to make change. Like you have to commit to reform or revolution. And she makes it very clear that, well, do you either want to be the top dog or do you want to appease the capitalists. And her major criticism is that she feels like while things were going swimmingly for the trade unions and cooperatives at the time, she kind of presented some premises and conclusions at in a book of, wait, but if you don't have full membership in a trade union, is it going to be effective? Oh, if you don't actually take away the source of a capitalist profit, is a cooperative useful? And it's definitely something to pause and have a think about.
Mm. Mm. It is an interesting notion, and quite a challenging one, because like the temptation is always, and obviously, to do something rather than nothing. And I think there is this definite perception out there that revolutionary aspirations are pie in the sky fantasy stuff, right?
Mm.
So like, why not work on what you can? You know, figure out what's within your control, and work towards refining that.
Mm.
So like that's why like we in this day and age we don't live in like these old school turn of the industrial revolution style capitalist societies. We live in social welfare societies.
Yeah.
So you have humane capitalism, and that was one off the backs of international workers movement, union action, and working class direction and impetus. So like the idea of that we have standard working conditions, the 8-hour working day, 8 hours rest, 8 hours leisure, the idea of a weekend, the idea of having some type of leave entitlements, these kind of things, yes, are part of the way that capitalism has been humanized and has become the accepted way of having capitalism. We have socialized healthcare. We have socialized education systems. These types of things, yes, they humanize capital, and they humanize capitalism. And it's very nice to have this form of this gentler form of capitalism, this less exploitative one, and that's all been done through regulation and reform. All of those things have been achieved through regulation and reform, but at the end of the day, it hasn't changed the core. It hasn't changed capitalism at all. And especially if you look at it through a neoliberal lens, which is it's the predominant kind of economic reality and predominant way of thinking. If anything, we are starting to lose all of those progressive achievements that delivered us this socialized form of capitalism, this welfare form of capitalism. And I think that's one of the big arguments I think that we should be taking away from reform or revolution here. You can have all these wonderful glossy things inside a capitalist system. They look like achievements and big wins, home runs, scores on the board. But like you give it a few generations and people become used to these things and forget where they came from. The capitalists won't. The dominant class won't. And they will bide their time until they're able to draw back some of those things and then win them back on their side and be able to profit from them once again like they did. Like the 1970s, the introduction of neoliberalist agenda and stuff like that, one of the main goals or like the initial features of neoliberalism was to smash the union movement. Look at what Thatcher did in the UK, Reagan in the US, and all of basically the Western or industrial capitalist nations of the world. They smashed and obliterated their union movements primarily. Because these are the things that were, getting runs on the board for the working class. And they were the first things that had to go. So you can attempt to reform and get little things going, But in the long run, unless you've got some good vision of where you're going and you can continue to move forward and potentially even exponentially, you're not going to hit any type of change from capitalist society onwards to socialism. So, like, I think we already have the historic evidence to suggest that reform isn't going to cut it if you're trying to get to a new form of society and away from a capitalistic one.
Well, this might be a good segue, but it's kind of the reason why you can see that last dot point that I have on the slide, that there's a recent phenomenon that I've kind of stumbled across that is a politics framing, or well, it's a way to frame politics, and it talks about the Overton window, and basically what the Overton window, I think it kind of goes into that reformist mindset. So what the Overton window is that effectively within society there is a political discourse that is acceptable. You can only speak within the Overton window. So, for example, if you decided to talk about prohibition, and since this isn't the 1920s, if you started just talking about how we should ban alcohol, all the voters would just look at you and think that you were mad. So that kind of talking point is outside the Overton window.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So this is what's very interesting, is that this sort of device, if you were to be a cynical person, you could be, I don't know, maybe somebody who has a lot of money and controls the media. You could have a very specific Overton window where, you know, socialism is a dirty word. That
I love it when you get cynical for IS. I love it.
Well, you know, socialism is a very dirty word. You know, talking about means of production, or
yes,
you know,
or even the word working class.
Yeah.
If you notice, it is very rarely used in political discourse or in the media. It's rare to, hardly ever, that you hear people use.
Well, when you do hear, well, at least any words that are in relation to the working class. I know it's not specifically about the working class, but it's definitely something to do with the poor. Like you'll get like a catchphrase like a dole bludger or something like that.
Yeah.
So almost as if you are of low status in our society, that is a bad thing. Though we're probably bleeding into a more American idea, which is, you know, the pursuit of happiness and, you know, trying to work your way up the rungs of society. But, you know, that's sort of
this idea of the Overton window, though, and what's acceptable discourse. Because, like, again, if we can take it back to the idea of that there's a dominant culture in society, it's bourgeois culture, and there's a dominant means of production, capitalist production, and both of them are looking out for their interests at all times. And you have basically all of these institutions like the media and the ones that set public discourse, or your politicians, and all of them are of or controlled by the bourgeois, the liberal classes, and they are able to set the window, this Overton window, then yes, you're only going to get discussion that is acceptable within the realms that they deem acceptable, obviously.
Yeah, but you can even view it in what an Overton window would look like, for example, in Australia. So, for example, I guess we're going very broad stroke here, but say, for example, you had somebody that was of higher status here in Australia.
Yep.
Somebody who was much more conservative.
Yeah.
It would be outside the Overton window for a more progressive party to go after franking credits and to go after, say, for example, property and
or negative gearing.
Sorry?
Or negative gearing.
Yes, and thank you. I was going in that direction. However, conversely, for a conservative government, it would 100% be out of the Overton window if you went after Medicare. You went after the health system that kept people, went after welfare systems that kept people above the poverty line, or gave them the reason to subsist, basically.
Yes, interesting. Okay. I like this concept, and it's definitely something I believe that is in existence, whether we are conscious of it or not. And I think that's the way it really works as well, that most people are not conscious of it, so they don't even know what is not being talked about. And that's the power of this mechanism, right?
Yeah. Well, it's the we might be going into a bit of Noam Chomsky right now, but it's the concept he likes to talk about, which is the magnifying glass with the media. It's really as much. It's really all about what's being talked about. So the media using devices like the Overton window of what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. So it's all about what's being talked about. So what's under that magnifying glass, as much as what's not being talked about.
Yes. And that's the big thing that we're talking about here, whether socialist, revolutionary, union, working class, all of these points of discussion are able to be given any light of day in public discourse. Yes, and I think, again, if we can tie back to this whole conversation now, then that is why someone like Rosa is telling us, if you're going to choose between reform or revolution, let's go with revolution here, because reform is working within the means of the system. And the system is geared against you heavily, by the sounds of it, with a mechanism like this. And so if you need to rely on people and people to be conscious of things in order for you to achieve your goals, good luck doing that within the framework. Good luck.
Well, yeah, Rosa pretty much makes the point of, hey, don't get me wrong, cooperatives, trade unions, what you have achieved is awesome. You should be proud of what you've achieved. However, what you need to keep in mind is everything that you have achieved to this point has been deemed acceptable by the capitalists.
Yes. So within their window.
Yeah. Basically, winning those wages, they would say, yeah, I can shave a few off my profit.
We can live with that. Yeah. Because you have to ask for anything too extreme, hell no, they will not allow you to get away with it.
But and especially since that it may not be the most dominant topic at the moment. That's in Russia. That's happening right now. But just look at the fall of the Soviet Union and just how quickly capitalism kind of rolled into there, and how it's just ruled by a bunch of Russian oligarchs. That a country that had one of the most successful socialist or communist revolutions that has been known to human history, that once the switch was flicked and socialism, I guess, ended in that country, how quickly the capitalists rolled in, and it's a completely different society than it was when the USSR failed.
Yeah. And they attempted that revolution.
Hmm.
But they just, if we go back to Trotsky's discussion, and even someone like Che Guevara had a very similar idea about you don't just stop at one revolution, you've got to keep revolutionizing everyone until you get enough steam to really be able to combat imperialism and capitalism. Yeah. Very interesting topic. Thank you for reading some Reform or Revolution for us.
No worries, Mr. A. Well, it's come to the last segments where, as everyone knows, what's that synthwave art? So just to let everyone know, last week's one, where it was about that shrouded figure that was at the bookshelf, the prompt for that one was a man standing at a crossroads, heading towards a mountain of knowledge. Now, I know that's not how the image worked out to be, but yeah, it was far more symbolic than it ended up being. So, to those listeners that have tuned in, just to kind of describe the image that we have for this week for revisionism, we have a bunch of skyscrapers that are in the back with a huge sunset. But then you can see in one of the buildings an edge, like a face that's edged into it. So I guess based on everything that we've talked about, this will be an interesting prompt in order to guess. So I'll leave it to everyone to have a crack at what they think the prompt is and leave it in the comments. And yeah, I think with that, that's a wrap for this week. Again, 2 weeks in a row, we've been succinct, so we're improving, Mr. A. So I guess with that, everyone, thank you for tuning in again, and keep thinking, keep learning. Mr. A.
Remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.